there is usually a team that's involved in trying to figure out where the soft points are in various economies. And so obviously going after Russia is different than going after Iran or North Korea or otherwise. You sort of look at the economies, look at these power structure, and try to figure out if you were to push economically to put pressure on the economy, which areas of that economy are going to be most susceptible to that sort of pressure. So that's really the question, is to figure out what is sanctions going to deny an economy, and are those denials going to lead to the economic pressure that you're after? And so in the context of Russia, looking at the energy sector, looking at the mining sector, looking at the defense sector, the banking sector, looking at the oligarchs, all of that comes into play, because the thought is that those are the levers to pull if what you're trying to do is pressure the Kremlin.
So they're looking at the most vulnerable areas, I suspect. But how effective are sanctions in times of war?
Well, in times of war, it depends on how what the success rate actually is that you're looking for. If what you're asking is there an impact of sanctions in times of war, or frankly in times of peace? As you said in the intro, the collapse of the ruble, the closure of the Moscow Stock Exchange, the rise of interest rates, inflation, and the rest in Russia demonstrates that there at least is an immediate impact for sure. There is a harm that is being incurred by sanctions. If the question, however, is, are sanctions effective in actually changing war strategy, changing, in this case, President Putin's desires with respect to Ukraine, that's a more challenging question, and frankly, one that I think the jury is still very much out on.
And parts of the jury are still out on whether sanctions are effective or not. I just want to quote the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who described sanctions, quote, as a necessary middle ground between war and words. Is that apposite? Do you agree?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, sanctions are very much a war by other means. And I think sanctions are resorted to because war, kinetic action, actual boots on the ground, are often not acceptable politically or viable when you're trying to figure out how to deal with a jurisdiction like Russia that is so large, so powerful, and frankly has nuclear weapons. You don't really want to get into a NATO fighting war with Russia. And so the question is, what are the other options on the table? And the reality is, fortunately or not, that there aren't that many other options other than sanctions.
President Xi Jinping of China has said that sweeping and indiscriminate sanctions only make the people suffer. But whenever sanctions are imposed, any government must try to bring the maximum force against a given administration, but without hurting the people of that country. Can that balance be reached?
Usually not. By that I mean that there's always collateral consequences. To say that you can really surgically target sanctions to only impact the elites or only impact decision makers with respect to be it Russia, be it Iran, or what have you, it is not accurate. The reality is that elites are often protected from the immediate impacts of sanctions. And the people on the streets, certainly poorer people that are less sort of susceptible to sort of having protections in place, so to speak, are going to be the ones that are impacted. So I think it's very, very hard to calibrate sanctions to eliminate the consequences to the average individual. You can reduce them for sure, but eliminating, I don't think is possible.
And the elephant in the room, Adam, I suppose, is, as you say, energy. The West needs Russian energy, doesn't it? And there must be a reluctance to affect that supply. Absolutely, absolutely. And so that's actually one of the big concerns I think many folks have. That over time, that if we do not focus on energy, the ability to really pressure President Putin will be limited. And of course, the challenge there is the Biden administration and frankly, the global community's desire to be unanimous, to have this multilateral approach with respect to Russia. And the U.S. can afford to limit oil imports, gas imports from Russia, which they've already done. Europe, as of now, in the middle of winter, beginning of spring perhaps, cannot afford to do that. And so that's the real challenge, is how do you sort of really turn the screws on President Putin if you're not willing to turn the screws on perhaps his principal export and source of hard currency. Does Russia have any sanctions weapons themselves?
They do. And this is another piece of the puzzle that is so interesting in the Russia context compared to any other jurisdiction that the West has ever sort of sanctioned, is that Russia has several cards to play on its own. The big one, as we already mentioned, is energy. That Russia could decide to throttle gas into Europe, and that would be a significant sort of risk, I think, for Europe, certainly in the near term. I think the other piece that's interesting is that Russia has its own regulatory structures. And so because so many companies have exposure in Russia, the idea of sort of secondary sanctions, or rather counter sanctions by Russia, could perhaps leave companies in some sort of risk themselves. So for example, if Russia sort of makes it a criminal offense to comply with Western sanctions in Russia, any company that's left there is left in a very challenging perspective, a very challenging condition. Are they going to sort of comply with Russia sanctions, comply with US sanctions, risk criminal liability in Russia or whatnot? Other components of Russia sort of that they could sort of play is that you might have heard about Russia being pulled out of the SWIFT banking system, SWIFT communication system. That was sort of interesting issue because it does limit the ability for Russia to sort of communicate to international banks. But Russia has its own domestic SWIFT system that it could sort of build up. And so one of the challenges, I think, from a sanctions perspective is, are we going to push Russia into sort of a non-dollar-based, non-Western financial sort of system in a way that it will be hard for them to bring back in the future, which is not really a sanction per se, but certainly a consequence that the West needs to be very aware of.
Just doing a little bit of research, and which showed that studies of more than 200 examples of sanctions since the 1930s showed at least 2/3 had failed to stop the aggressor while causing adverse side effects. So there is a downside to sanctions.
Without a doubt, that sanctions record is sort of mixed, to say the least. But again, it really depends on what your measure of success is. If what you are saying is President Putin going to change his mind with respect to Ukraine in the immediate term, I think sanctions are not going to work in that context.
I think that personally targeted measures, sequestering the fortunes of leaders, are far more likely to work than wider sanctions, which affects whole nations, not least because they cause less collateral damage, don't they?
That's right. So the oligarch sanctions are very interesting for exactly that reason, that the idea behind the oligarch sanctions, again, I think it's questionable how successful it will be, but certainly the idea behind the oligarch sanctions is that you can really target parties that have a lot of money and arguably, or at least potentially, some influence over President Putin or those around him. That if you pressure the oligarchs, you could potentially cause them to pressure President Putin indirectly. I think that, again, I think that's somewhat of a misguided notion, depending on the oligarch.
So how do you ensure then that the sanctions are in fact complied with?
Well, this is another piece that I'm finding very interesting about this most recent round of sanctions at the beginning of the Ukraine sort of invasion. Two parts of it that give me some hope. The first is that it is truly multilateral, right? Again, as I said, sanctions have been imposed since 2014, excuse me, since 2014 after the Crimea incursion. But principally, those sanctions were done by the United States. The Europeans were involved, but it was much more of a piecemeal effort, I think is a safe way to call it. But now it's truly multilateral, right? You've got the EU plus the UK, the rest of the G7, including Japan and Canada. Even Switzerland have sort of gotten off the sidelines, the neutral sidelines where they usually sit, and has started to impose sanctions as well. So that's the first part that gives me some hope. The other part is sanctions after the implementation, that's enforcement. And here we're also seeing action. Even in Europe, where I think it's fair to say that enforcement of sanctions has been fairly meek compared to what you saw on the other side of the Atlantic in the United States. You've already seen the Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spaniards move very aggressively against yachts, for example, of oligarchs. You've seen the Brits get off the sidelines as well and sort of really start attacking sort of the ability for Russians and frankly others to hide their money in assets like big properties in Belgravia and Kensington. And so there's an enforcement piece here in addition to the multilateral piece. It gives me some hope with respect to enforcement. Whether it will happen, what will happen in the long term, I don't know. But certainly the signs are much more positive now that we'll see effective sanctions in a way that we perhaps never have before.
Adam, the bottom line is, will these sanctions work?
I think not. I think the problem with sanctions as a response is that the tool itself is much more slow-moving than war. Right? Kinetic action literally moves often at the speed of sound, if not faster. And that's what you're seeing on the ground. Even if the Russian troops are being bogged down, they're moving. Whereas sanctions can take weeks, months, and in some cases even years to build up the necessary pressure to move the policy needle with respect to the parties that are being targeted. So I think in the immediate term, the likelihood of sanctions causing President Putin to rethink what's going on in Ukraine is very low. also because at the end of the day, President Putin has structured his Ukraine incursion as a legacy-defining action for him.
Sanctions lawyer Adam Smith, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda.
My pleasure.